developmental. So I'm Tanya Bielski-Brom. I am the development associate here at the Holocaust Center. Thank you, full house. We're thrilled that you're all here. We're thrilled that you support the Holocaust Center. Our mission here is so important, more than ever, and we're so grateful to have two amazing speakers tonight, two empowering women who are going to tell stories from their family survivors. Our first speaker will be Lynne Ravas, and she's going to present she's going to make a presentation, she'll take questions, then we're going to have a quick technical changing of computers, and then Alison Brown Karabin, my dear friend, is also coming up. She will do a presentation and then also take questions. There's food, water, please help yourself. We can hang out afterwards. Look for me if you want to buy copies of Chutzpah. After the presentation, I'll be out front. And that's about it. So thank you so much for being here, and let the show begin.
Nothing like technical issues. Get this plugged in. There we go. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out tonight and for letting me share one of the many survivor stories that I am familiar with. In my 40 years as a Holocaust educator, I've met survivors, and I think what we sometimes forget is that every survivor's story is as unique as that individual. You've probably heard multiple stories from a particular camp or about hidden children, and they all can tell you something different. Do we need them? Okay. All right. I will talk louder. Each of the stories has something unique to share, and that's what we have to be aware of. So this story that I'm sharing this evening is unique in the fact that it started here in the United States. And when we think of Holocaust stories, this is not where we think of the original setting. But in 1936, Francie and Bernie Rosenbaum were a young married couple living in the Bronx. They recently had a daughter added to their family, and they had had a son a few years earlier, but unfortunately he passed away within a few hours of birth. And when their daughter was born, Francie's doctors told her and Bernie that if they had any more children, Bernie would probably be a widower. And so the decision was made that if they wanted to expand their family, adoption was the logical way to go. But it was 1936. And Francie and Bernie, being a Jewish couple in New York City, were well aware of what was happening in Germany at the time. And their decision was not just to adopt a child, but to adopt a child who had no family to protect him or her from what was happening in Nazi Germany. But it was 1936, and finding a child in a Jewish orphanage or a Jewish family somewhere that they could adopt was not that easy. Fortunately, Bernie and Francie were married, Bernie's brother, to Francie's sister. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters. And when they were together one evening, Francie's sister Rachel said that her neighbor had recently hired a housekeeper who had emigrated from Germany. And this housekeeper had come from a small town where there was a Jewish orphanage. So now Francie and Bernie had a starting point. And they were not the only couples in the Bronx who were looking to do that. There were other couples who wanted to adopt as well. But getting to Germany, adopting a child was not an easy process. So Francie and Bernie started making inquiries. They contacted the orphanage that this woman had told them about in the town of Dinslagen in northwestern Germany. Now, remembering that Francie and Bernie were in the Bronx, making arrangements to travel to the town of Dinslagen meant that they had to arrange passage on a ship. This was not an easy thing to do for a young couple, especially during the Great Depression. Francie was a high school English teacher in Harlem. Bernie had a little business of his own with a partner. They were secure, but it was not an easy time. And to travel like that was also risky, but it was worth it to them. So they made arrangements and they did travel to the orphanage in Germany. And when they arrived, this is the building that they found. The orphanage in Dinslagen was part of really 3 orphanages in that part of Europe. And they housed children usually from the ages of 6 to 16. There was another orphanage for children younger than that. They had approximately 35 children at the time Francie and Bernie arrived. They had a headmaster and they had teachers. They had people who lived with the children because that building was the entire world for those 35 children. It was their home, their school, and their social life. It was a lovely place to grow up, however, if you had to be in an orphanage. You can see from these postcards that the orphanage used as part of advertising back in the day, that they had a nice dining room for the older children. The younger children, of course, you can see the kids' table. We've all been there, okay? Where somebody could help the younger children. They had their classroom, mixed ages because of the variety of children that they had and the limited faculty that they had at that time because the Jewish children could not attend the public schools. They did take the children on outings. Here you can see them in the summertime, the kids going out. They would try to take them to the country. They might take them to a lake. They would do wonderful activities with them when they could. This was well supported by the Jewish community. Picnic in the backyard, just the types of activities many of us are familiar with. And you can see the children's table there for some of the younger ones. Francie and Bernie arrived and they spent some time. They had talked a little bit ahead of time in their letters with the head of the orphanage and the society that supported it and explained that they wanted a little boy between the ages of 1 and 5. Obviously, they wanted a big brother for their daughter, Laura, and Francie desperately wanted to add that son to her family. But it was 1937 as they were continuing this process, and the Nazi government said, whoa, we're not really fond of our Jewish citizens, but why would another group of people from another country want to take one of our children out of the country? And at the same time, the US government, particularly the State Department, said, whoa, you want to bring refugees into this country? How do we know that you're really going to care for this child once the child arrives? What if you decide there's a problem? You don't want to take care of him. It's going to be a burden on society. And so Francie and Bernie had to return from Dinslagen without a child. They had to come back and complete the paperwork. Now, the State Department required that Francie and Bernie have proof of residence. They lived in a duplex in the Bronx. Bernie was well employed. They had to have character references from people that they knew. The chief of police had to write a letter saying that they did not have a criminal record. And of course, they wanted physical and psychological evaluations of this refugee that Francie and Bernie wanted to bring to the country. So that meant Francie and Bernie had to complete paperwork. They had to send it either airmail or they put it on a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. They had to send money to pay for these doctors. And as they were going through this process, they received a telegram from the orphanage saying, we're very sorry, but the little boy that you selected has been adopted by someone else. However, you might remember a little boy by the name of Hans. And Francie said, absolutely, she did remember him. In fact, he is this little boy right here, among all the ladies. Francie said, we'll take him. She wanted a son. And so the paperwork had to be changed. This is going to prolong the process, but it was worth it to them. You can see here, this is one of my favorite photos of this orphanage because some of us remember the days when we were allowed to swing like that on a swing set. We don't allow children anymore to do that. I especially appreciate the ping pong table behind the swing set, so you had to watch when you went for your shots. And you can see the children having a wonderful time there. We actually have the testimony from a young man who was a child in the town of Dinslagen. He did not live in the orphanage. But when the Nuremberg laws went into place and he could not go to the park any longer, he would come over here to play. And so he talked about what a wonderful place it was. Francie and Bernie got all the paperwork taken care of. The German government, the American consulate in Stuttgart was satisfied. The State Department was satisfied. And this final paperwork came through to Francie and Bernie. And a few days later, the newspaper headlines for November 9th and 10th, 1938. Kristallnacht. And the town of Dinslagen did not escape that night. In fact, Bernie and Francie were not to find out for quite a while what exactly happened. What happened was 3 men arrived on November 9th at the orphanage. They ordered the headmaster to close all the blinds on the front of the building because they did not want anyone watching what was happening on the street. Everyone had to stay inside. The next day, 50 men showed up at the orphanage. Many of those men being police officers, men in uniform, carrying guns, loud voices, coming into an orphanage filled with children whose only home that most of them remembered was that building. The headmaster, in his quick thinking, thought that the best thing to do for those children was to tell them to run out into the street. He thought they might be safer if they were out in the street where people could see them. But the little boy Hans, like many of us, he was 6 years old at that time, panicked, as did some of the other small children. Hearing people yelling, telling them to run, they panicked. Hans ran down a hallway where there were 2 French doors. And in his haste to get out of that building, he did not turn the handles, he just shoved on the door. And the glass broke, cutting his wrist. And he ran out here to those hedges. And you know how 6-year-olds are. They get their head firmly underneath the hedge and their rear end might be sticking out, but they think if they can't see you, you can't see them. But of course, the men who came to the orphanage ordered the teachers to round up all of the children and take them to another location where they were held for a few days. And after those few days, the headmaster was told to take the children back to the orphanage. But the orphanage had been looted. You see, people believed the stereotype that if they were Jewish, they had to have valuables, they had to have money, even though these were orphans who had no family. People were convinced that somebody had left them something. And so people went into the kitchen, and think about the amount of food you would need for 35 children and all the adults who would take care of them. And they ripped open the bags of flour and rice and dumped them on the ground in case something was hidden inside. They dumped other containers of food on the floor, and they ripped the kitchen cabinets off the walls to see if there was a hidden compartment behind them. They found nothing. So they went upstairs to the children's bedrooms. And of course, they ripped open mattresses and pillows. People had already gone through and broken windows. And so they threw the furniture out the second floor window so it would shatter on the street below. In case someone had hollowed out the leg of a chair or a bed and stuffed something valuable up inside, it would shatter and be found then on the street. They found nothing. They then went to the bathrooms and they ripped the sinks and toilets off the walls looking for anything that might have been hidden in a pipe. Again, they found nothing. And the headmaster was told to take the children back to live in this building until further orders. They could not take the children into the building for the first couple of nights, so they slept out here in the backyard until they could make it safe enough for the children to come in. And then the Nazis decided that they were going to make the town of Dinslagen Judenrein. And they rounded up all the Jewish people in town at a certain time. But they were a little confused about what they were going to do with these orphans. You need enough adults to take care of them. So the headmaster was told that he could contact two of the sister orphanages. One was in Belgium and one was in Amsterdam. Temporarily, they could go to Cologne and stay there, but then the children had to be sent to one of those other two orphanages. The children were told to report along with everyone else, and the headmaster was given a rick wagon, one of those farm wagons. And the small children were placed in the rick wagon, and the older children pushed and pulled it through town to the place that they were supposed to finally be. Hans was in the group of children that was sent to Amsterdam. And after he arrived in Amsterdam, the orphanage there sent a telegram to Bernie and Francie letting them know that Hans was now safely in Amsterdam and they would now need to make arrangements to get him moved to the United States. Now you're talking another consulate. It's a different country. Finally, on April 24th, 1939, Hans had just turned 7 years old. His ship landed in Hoboken. A friend of Bernie's who had family in Amsterdam, a family business, he ran an office in New York City, had made arrangements to get Hans onto a ship and to arrange for a young woman to accompany Hans, because you could not put a 7-year-old on a ship for that long. And so Francie and Bernie had sent the money to pay for all of this. Francie and Bernie were, as you can imagine, quite nervous. Now, you see here the pictures that the orphanage had sent Francie and Bernie to let them know which child it was that they were going to be receiving. This was the synagogue in the town of Dinslagen that was burned, as were so many others across Germany and Austria in November of 1938. And this is Hans's immigration visa and his German identity card. He got off the ship that day speaking German. He did not remember the people who had come to see him in the orphanage. All he knew was, congratulations, you're getting a new family in a new country. Fortunately, Francie spoke several languages, including German. And on the taxi ride home, Francie informed Hans that his new name was Frederick. See how much she wanted that son for Francie? And Freddie is what she called him until her dying day. And when he got off the ship that day, he was wearing this pair of lederhosen that is badly stained, but it's what he had coming from an orphanage. And he was wearing this little jacket, missing a button. And Francie and Bernie realized that before they could go home, they needed to take him shopping. Francie said that for the first few months after Fred moved in with them, every time he would hear a siren, he would run and hide. The Bronx, quite a few sirens. He thought it was an air raid. And it took Francie a while to convince him that in this country, a siren means someone's coming to help you, not hurt you. When Francie felt that his English was strong enough, she enrolled him in school. And he had not been there very long. And although he spoke some English, he had a very heavy German accent. And one day, his teacher told him that if he didn't shape up, that he would be sent back to where he came from. Needless to say, Francie was not very happy and had a little chat with the teacher. But it made it hard for him to want to go back to school. He did go back to school, and he did get rid of his German accent. He learned to speak with a very good Bronx accent, and he could play stickball in the street, and he was an expert at skipping school. In fact, Francie was not sure he was going to graduate from high school, but he did, and he went off to college, and he met a young woman. They were married in 1953, and they had 4 children, and I am the eldest of those 4 children. Wow. This is how close I came to not being here. The Jewish proverb says, when you save one life, you save the world. Francie and Bernie desperately wanted a little boy. That's all they cared about. Francie died when I was in high school, and I'm the eldest of the grandchildren. So she did not live to see how many people she saved, because my parents have 4 children, 10 grandchildren, and so far 4 great-grandchildren. And my parents are in the midst of planning their 65th wedding anniversary, because I'm lucky enough to have them both here with me. We forget sometimes that a small act of kindness will resonate. That ripple effect can go so very far. They wanted to help one child, and they helped so many others. On the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the town of Dinslagen erected a memorial. I think it's one of the better memorials, if you will, to what happened. Because what they did in this memorial is they gave you a choice. Do you want to stand with the perpetrator, the Nazi soldier? Do you want to stand here along the railing and the sidewalk? Because as that rick wagon was pushed and pulled through the town and the other Jewish families were taken out of town, the non-Jewish people stood along the sidewalk and spit on them and threw rocks and called them names. Or do you want to stand by the rick wagon? Do you want to stand with the victims? That rick wagon is breaking through a wall. On one side of the wall are the names of all the Jewish families that had lived in Dinslagen prior to Kristallnacht. And on the other side of the wall are the names of the children who were in the orphanage. And Hans's name is right here. We believe there were somewhere between 3 and 5 children who survived from the orphanage. And the reason that I have those photographs of the orphanage is from one of the other survivors whom my father tracked down about 20 years ago. She was 10 years older than he at the time that they were all separated. And when she opened the door, she called him by a name. And he looked at her and he said, "Why did you call me that? It's always been in the back of my mind." And she said, "That was our nickname for you." What we do makes such a difference. And we all have so much to be thankful for being here at the Holocaust Center tonight, a place that allows us to share this and to continue to do good work. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If there are any questions, I'll answer them, but otherwise I will allow Alison to start. Okay, Alison, I get her up. Okay, let me see. I wanted to make sure.
Hi, can you hear me? I'll talk a little louder then. Thank you for having me here this evening. My name is Alison Karabin, and bear with me, this is my first time speaking publicly, almost ever. So So my grandmother, Elizabeth Brown, was born on December 13th, 1918 in Ausztros, a small rural village in northeastern Hungary near the town of Eger. These are actually my grandmother's grandparents, whose names she didn't know, but from what we know from family lore is that her family had been in Hungary since about the 14th century. There were some records in a battle that they had been recorded in the regional history. Anyhow, she was the younger daughter of Serena and Joseph Klein. Elizabeth had a very close relationship with her older sister, Ilona, or Ilonka as she was called, who was 3 years older and lived in a nearby village with her husband and their daughter, Veronica. Elizabeth's father, Joseph, was a businessman and landowner. This is actually the same picture, but it was a postcard that he sent to his family. He was wounded during World War I, and he had to recuperate in a hospital in Vienna. And this is pictured on the postcard. So he was a businessman and landowner, and he owned a general store, a butcher shop, and vineyards. And later he became a wine wholesaler. That region of Hungary is very well known for wine. The area of Tokaj is not real close to there, but Eger, the nearby town, is known for both red and white wines. And while he was not the biggest landowner in the area, he was the largest taxpayer because of his businesses and land holdings. Serena, her mother, helped out with the store and the running of the household. The family employed a manservant who took care of the horse and buggy and lived with them, and a female helper who worked for the Kleins during the day. Joseph often traveled away from home for work, buying animals to slaughter for his butcher shop, and also for his role as a regional councilman. Elizabeth's family was fairly religious. They had to buy, this is ironic, they had to buy kosher meat from the nearby city of Eger because the meat that her father slaughtered it for his butcher shop was not kosher. But Eger, the nearby town, was about 4 miles away. And my grandmother described her childhood as idyllic. Her parents had a very happy marriage, and their family was well integrated into the village life. They were the only Jews in their village. And it's funny, I never grew up hearing Yiddish from my grandparents. And my grandmother says she never learned Yiddish because they were the only Jews in the village. Her parents knew Yiddish, but they didn't want people to think that they were talking about them. So they never spoke Yiddish to each other. That might be true. It might just be a family story. But they had very good relationships with their neighbors. And my great-grandfather, this picture, Joseph, he was a wounded veteran in World War I, and the Hungarian government offered him a pension, which he refused because he felt that serving in the war was his patriotic duty. My grandmother Elizabeth attended a Catholic primary school. It was the only school in the village, and she remarked that the nuns who taught her were sensitive to her religious obligations, and they didn't make her write on Saturday, on the Sabbath. She went to a vocational school, and she was eventually trained as a dental assistant. She made dentures, and apparently denture technology has not changed a lot since the 1930s. My grandmother said that she really experienced no anti-Semitism growing up. The regional economy was very good. Her family had good relationships with the neighbors around them, and her father was very well known and well respected. In March of 1944, when my grandmother was 26 years old, the Germans invaded Hungary. She first saw the Germans in Eger, the nearest town. When she saw them, she hopped on her bicycle and rushed home to her mother, who began immediately to scream and cry. Her father was in Mezőkövesd, a town about 10 miles away. After that, there was no mail or telephone for Jews. Jews were not allowed to travel, and her father's shop was closed. Jews were not allowed to sell things at that point. The Klein home was the largest in their village, so the Germans occupied it as their headquarters and forced them to empty the household. Her family, with the help of many people in the village, took all of the furniture and merchandise from the store and put it in the family's wine cellar. The Kleins were then moved to an empty house at the end of the village. And they remained there for about 10 days when they were told to pack a knapsack, and they were transferred to a ghetto in Mezhkovezh, a town about 10 miles away, along with all the other Jews in the area. In Mezhkovezh, a few streets were emptied and the Jews were locked in. Elizabeth's family occupied one room of a house. It was cramped but livable, and they shared the house with her mother's sisters and their families. After a week or 10 days, they were put on a train to Diostor on the outskirts of Miskolc, which is a larger town further to the northeast, and they were locked in an abandoned brick factory. It was there that my grandmother was reunited with her sister Ilonka and her niece Veronica. Ilonka's husband had already been sent to forced labor near the Russian front. But the conditions in Diostor, in this abandoned brick factory, were terrible. They were locked in dusty sheds. It was crowded. There was no furniture. People just sat on the dirt floor, and they were not given any food. They just ate what they brought from the ghetto in Mezhkovezh. And it was during the 3 days that they were in this very difficult place that my grandmother heard her father crying at night for the first time. After 3 days, they were put on trains, and the conditions on the trains were unimaginable. They were locked into cramped cars. There were no supplies, no facilities. That's my grandmother's nice way of saying no bathrooms. And I think the shock and the horror of people could only control themselves for so long. Eventually, people had to urinate and defecate on themselves in front of other people. And this lasted for 3 days. Eventually, they were together, which was fortunate, but the train ride was something that just sounded horrible. It was on the train ride that my great-grandfather Joseph told my grandmother Elizabeth advice that would save her life. Through the slats in the train, he saw people working in a field, and he noticed they were wearing what looked like prisoners' uniforms. And he told her, whenever you're given the opportunity to work, take it. At the end of the train ride in June 1944, Elizabeth and her family found themselves in Auschwitz. They didn't know it was Auschwitz, but that's where they ended up. All the new arrivals were separated, men from women, and lined up for selection by Dr. Mengele. When it came to my grandmother's sister's turn, she was standing with her daughter, and Dr. Mengele approached them and asked who the girl belonged to. He couldn't believe that a woman as young looking as my grandmother's sister could have a child as old as the girl that she was with. And he tried to get her to deny that that was her child, and tried to separate them. She wouldn't be separated, and both my grandmother's sister and her niece were sent with my grandmother's mother one way, and my grandmother was sent elsewhere. My grandmother's father was sent off with the men, and that was the last time that my grandmother would see her family again. My grandmother Elizabeth was taken with a group of young, healthy Hungarian women to Birkenau, an adjacent camp that was not yet completed. The barracks had no windows, there were no bunks, they just slept on the floor, there was no heat, no running water, no toilets. There were about 500 women in her barrack, and upon arrival, she said they were given showers, their hair was all cut off, and they were given a change of clothes and a metal dish for food. And my grandmother described the first night in Birkenau as very chaotic. People were talking to each other, and everyone was very anxious. And one of the guards came up and said to them, yelled at them to be quiet, and said, "Do you smell that burning smell? Those are your families." And after that, everyone was silent. Shortly after she arrived, Elizabeth was given the opportunity to work. She volunteered to maintain the toilets or latrines. They had 25 wooden boxes set up with holes cut in them and buckets below. People who did this work did not stay in the barracks. They were able to sleep in the hospital, which wasn't really a medical facility, but rather a holding place to take people to the gas chambers. The workers were given an extra set of clothes for work, and they had the ability to wash themselves off after work. Because the conditions at Birkenau were so unsanitary, for example, all the women's dishes, the 500 women in the barracks, they were washed together. My grandmother remarked that they were often dirtier when they came out than when they put them in. So she and the other workers decided to keep their dishes hidden in the hospital, which was not allowed. Eventually, they were found out, and Dr. Mengele hit my grandmother so hard that she actually fell into one of the latrines. He then decided to make an example of this group of workers in front of the whole camp, and they were lined up twice a day and counted. So it was during one of these countings that he lined up the work group in front, and he asked a German prisoner of war, whose name was Schaefer, to give each person 50 lashes. And this German said, "No, I cannot hit a woman." And while in today's terms this might sound a little sexist, but this was a really pivotal moment for my grandmother, that somebody could have the courage to say no to such a powerful person. And strangely enough, that was the end of it. Dr. Mengele walked away and was never revisited. My grandmother remained at Birkenau until November 1944, when the cold weather set in. They were taken to the sea lager across the street from Birkenau, where the conditions were slightly better. There were windows, bunk beds, toilets, and running water. After 3 days in the sea lager, there was another selection. Elizabeth, along with about 2,000 women, were given work clothes and bread and put on a regular passenger train. They were taken to a farm in Germany to dig anti-tank ditches. It started off well. The work was hard, but the rations were better. The group slept in a barn and had straw and blankets. As the weather grew colder, though, the work became harder, the ground was frozen, and their clothing proved to be inadequate. They would stuff straw in their clothes for warmth and use picks to dig the ditches that were about 5 or 6 meters wide and deep, and then they would camouflage them so the tanks would roll into them. The living conditions grew even poorer, though, when the pump for the well froze and they could no longer clean themselves. Lice became rampant among the prisoners. When the ground was completely frozen, the Germans brought in men from Poland to use dynamite to break up the frozen soil. These men were very hostile to the female prisoners. My grandmother's group worked up until the second day of Christmas, 1944, when the front began approaching. They started walking on foot with no food on what became known later as the Volary Death March. 1,300 Jewish women over the course of 106 days and nights would travel over 550 miles. Because they were given no food, my grandmother and other prisoners would eat grass or garbage or whatever they could beg for or steal. I realized I completely forgot about pictures. I'm just gonna take a break. This is my great-grandfather and some people that worked for him, and this is a wine barrel. This was my grandmother, her sister Ilonka, and her daughter Veronica, and this is another picture of Veronica. Oops. That's yet to come. Anyhow, they set off on this march, and they had no food. They just had whatever grasses they could find, or whatever they could beg from villagers or steal. Anyone who tried to escape or became too weak or ill to work was shot. At night, the Germans would lock them up wherever they could. In some areas, though, the villagers would have sympathy for the women and give them boiled potatoes. My grandmother recalled once that she got hold of a live chicken and was mobbed by a group of the women, and they just tore it apart and ate it raw. You can imagine the deprivation that they felt. The march seemed to have no purpose and no end, and my grandmother thought that maybe the guards that were keeping them didn't want to be sent to the front, so they were sort of using these prisoners as some sort of pawn. But they marched through Dresden twice, and she remembers being in Dresden before the bombing and then being in Dresden after the bombing. At some point, Elizabeth's feet really began to hurt, but she wouldn't dare remove her shoes, and she explained that shoes were your life. You got one pair, and if something happened to your shoes, you just basically would wrap your feet in rags and it's not very effective. In the spring of 1945, though, on a cold May day, the march ended in a small village near the Czech border. The women were put into a yard, and they noticed that there were no guards around. Eventually, the guards came back, and the women were lined up and counted, and then a couple days later, the guards disappeared again. This time, they never came back. A couple of days later, they were liberated by the U.S. Army's 2nd Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division. My grandmother recalled feeling goose pimples thinking about that day and how the 2 Jewish chaplains that were assigned to that unit cried like children when they saw these women. The women, who had started off at 1,300 people at the beginning of the march, now numbered 118. They were carried on stretchers by the American Army to a school that was made into a makeshift hospital. The women were bathed, loused, and given gowns. In the first few days, another 26 women would die in the hospital. My grandmother, Elizabeth Klein, was a patient in bed number 18. She was diagnosed with emaciation, glossitis, a swollen tongue, stomatitis, canker sores in her mouth, edema of both of her feet, dehydration, and gangrene. And she recalls the strangeness being in the hospital because she was so weak that they had to feed her with a spoon, but 2 days or 3 days earlier, she had been marching. And she also recalled how in the hospital, the U.S. Army soldiers and medics were documenting the condition of all of these women and how they would photograph them, and the women would be naked with maybe some cloths to cover their private parts. And my grandmother said she looked at these women and she thought, wow, they look really, really terrible. And then they came to photograph her and she realized that she looked just like everyone else. In fact, my grandmother was in such bad shape with the gangrene that the doctors wanted to amputate the lower thirds of both of her legs, but she was stubborn and she refused. Eventually, somehow, they only took off her little toes and packed her feet with gauze. She stayed with the Americans from May 8th to August 4th, 1945, when she decided to return to Hungary to see if any other members of her family had survived. Her homecoming, though, was very sad. Almost all of the villagers who she had grown up with shunned her. They were ashamed that they had taken her family's belongings. Everything they had that they had put in the wine cellars were gone. A school friend of hers, though, took her in, and she was able to find 3 jars with gold that her father had buried before the war. While she knew what the fate of her mother, sister, and niece were, my grandmother hoped that her father had somehow survived, but sadly, that was not the case. For a while, my grandmother was able to run her family's farm by renting land to tenant farmers. Her future husband, Paul Brown, had spent 3 years in forced labor near Shianki, Poland, during the war. Prior to the war, my grandfather had been a client of my great-grandfather's because his family owned a tavern in the nearby town of Mezőkövesd, and they would buy wine from my grandmother's father. So he came to Ostrov, where my grandmother was, to buy some wine for his business, and he began to court her. My grandparents were eventually married in March 1946 in a small civil ceremony with only the mayor and a witness present, stating that at that time, no one was in the mood for big weddings. And they later got married, though, by a rabbi in Budapest when my grandmother became pregnant. My father, Peter Joseph Brown, was born in Mezőkövesd on January 5th, 1947. And my grandparents realized very quickly that they did not want to raise their son in Hungary, a place where there was so much hate. My grandmother had an aunt, her mother's older sister, who she'd never met, named Shari Ungar, who lived in Pittsburgh. She owned a restaurant, a Hungarian restaurant that is where the Bartlett Street Giant Eagle is now. So after the war, I guess my aunt, or her aunt, had contacted my grandmother to see who had survived from the family, and they made up their mind that they were going to move to America, to Pittsburgh, to be near family. Moving to America was not that simple, though. My grandparents and father eventually left Hungary in December 1948 with an immigration visa to Chile. Now, I didn't quite understand this, but at the time in Hungary, to get a passport to leave the country, you had to prove where you were going to. So you had to have an immigration visa from another country. And at the time, the only country that would welcome them was Chile. So they took it with the hopes that they could make some sort of connection in Switzerland and head to the United States. But they just were very determined to leave Hungary. When they got to Zurich, their connection fell through, and somehow they ended up in Paris, where they were stuck for over 2 years. My family had lost their refugee status when they returned to Hungary after the war to search for family. They couldn't work when they were in Paris as they were in transit and had no legal status in France. They even had to check in with the police each month and prove that they weren't earning any money. Their time in Paris was a desperate one. My grandparents made multiple attempts to obtain US immigration papers and were denied each time. At some point, my grandparents were both very depressed, and they even talked about contemplating suicide if it wasn't for their young son, my father. My grandmother decided, as a last-ditch effort, to write a letter in Hungarian, which she took to the Berlin School in Paris to be translated into English. In her letter, my grandmother explained their determination to get away from the new communist government in Hungary and summarized their 27 frustrating and disappointing months in Paris. She enclosed a photograph of little Peter and wrote, "This is why we must come to America." She sent the letter off to President Truman. A short time later, they received a letter from the president's cabinet telling them the US Embassy in Paris would contact them soon. A few days later, they found themselves inside the US Embassy and were asked, "How soon would you be able to leave?" To which they replied, "We can put everything we own into 2 shopping bags." Less than a week later, they boarded the French ship Liberty, bound for America. They arrived in New York Harbor on February 5th, 1951, where they were met by Elizabeth's aunt's husband, who vouched for them with the immigration department, stating that he would accept responsibility for their support and they would not be a burden on the government. When they arrived in Pittsburgh, my grandfather got a job relatively quickly at Rosenblum's Bakery on Murray Avenue. He worked there up until he retired 35 years later. Started off as a baker's helper and worked his way up to a bread baker and a union member. Well, I think it must have been difficult for my grandfather to go from a successful business owner in Hungary to a baker's assistant. He always seemed to enjoy his work. Rosenblum's employed a number of Hungarians, and he felt at home there. Anecdotally, I remember as a child always going into Rosenblum's and having my choice of anything in the display cabinet. And I thought that the nice ladies just gave you things after they pinched your cheeks. I didn't realize that other people had to pay money in Rosenblum's. I had a charming childhood. The transition to life in Pittsburgh was more difficult for my grandmother. She likely suffered from what we now know as PTSD, and her relationship with her aunt was strained. The only work that Elizabeth could find at first was as a seamstress, which she hated. She worked as a seamstress for 7 long years until she got the courage to speak to a crossing guard that she passed every day on her way to work. She really envied the crossing guard, who worked outdoors, had a very smart uniform, and worked with children. The crossing guard told her a bit about the job and how to apply at the city-county building. At the time, and I don't know if this is still true, but crossing guards were part of the police force, and there was a height minimum of 5 feet. And my grandmother was 4'10" at best. So she wore her highest heeled boots for her interview and got the job and worked at a job that she loved for 27 years, crossing children at Forbes and Whiteman, Colfax School, St. Philomena's, and later at Starrett School. My father, Peter Brown, grew up to be a very dutiful son. He got good grades in school and graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a degree in architecture. He had an ROTC scholarship at CMU and served in the Corps of Engineers at Fort Belvoir, Northern Virginia. He was a captain when he was discharged from the Army. For my father, the Army was a means to an end. He wanted an education, they didn't have the money for college, and he ended up serving at the end of the Vietnam War. But for my grandparents, his service as an officer in the U.S. Army was a point of great pride. Like many new immigrants, my grandparents were very patriotic and felt a great debt of gratitude to their new homeland. In college, Peter met a lovely CMU student named Stephanie Gross, and they married in 1971 and moved to Virginia, where my dad was stationed. After I was born, we moved back to Pittsburgh, and the family grew to include my brother David and my sister Rachel. We were always very close with my grandparents. We grandkids spent a lot of time at their house, often eating dinner on a weeknight, and we would visit sometimes on Friday nights after dinner when they hosted their Hungarian friends over for cards, coffee, and cake. The men would play this card game that I never understood in the kitchen, and the women would gossip and smoke cigarettes in the dining room. There was always a strong aroma of coffee from their kitchen percolator and my grandmother's cakes. We kids would roam from room to room, having our cheeks pinched and understanding little, as the language spoken was always Hungarian. When I was a kid, I was fascinated with Hungary, and I would ask my grandparents to teach me Hungarian, and they refused. My grandfather told me that we were Americans and we would speak English. That said, his English was pretty poor, and he would always lapse into Hungarian after speaking a few sentences, and I would remind him in Hungarian to speak English, please. My grandparents' social circle was all Hungarian survivors and refugees. They were a tight-knit group of people, and I really feel like they each filled in for the family that the others had lost. They shared in both celebrations and sadness, and I don't know how many Hungarian speakers are here, but in Hungarian, it's polite to call an older person auntie or uncle, neni or bacsi. And I think I was a teenager before I realized that I wasn't actually related to all these aunts and uncles that I had grown up with. My grandparents, particularly my grandmother, began to talk with me about the Holocaust when I was about 12 years old. I thought it was very strange, but now that I read about it, she never spoke to my father about it. I think she felt he was too sensitive. I think also when he was young and he learned English before they really learned English, he was burdened with translating always for my grandparents, and that was something that little kids normally don't have to do. And my grandmother felt a great deal of guilt that my dad was a sad child, I think because of those hopeless and sad years in Paris. Years later, I would talk about it with my dad, who admitted that he knew things, but he never wanted to burden my grandparents by asking about it. My grandparents were really wonderful people. They showered us with love and affection. It's often hard for me to imagine surviving what they did and coming out as positive and as happy as they were. My grandmother loved playing cards, gardening, and a good cup of coffee and a cigarette as she said it. As they got older, they moved from their house in Point Breeze, which had a large garden, to an apartment in Squirrel Hill in the Maxa Towers. My grandmother really missed her garden, and she was notorious for walking around that part of Squirrel Hill with a pair of scissors in her purse. And if she saw pretty flowers in someone's yard, she would snip a few to take home. Up until her last few years, she was pretty spry thanks to her regime of water aerobics at the JCC 3 times a week, and she could outrun any homeowners who came after her. Those that she couldn't outrun, she could charm with her twinkly blue eyes and thick Hungarian accent. My grandmother, Elizabeth Klein Brown, passed away in December 2016 at the age of 98. So this is one of those perfectly imperfect pictures that we took before digital photography. But in 1985, my family, who ranged in age from 3 to 73, took a trip to Europe. My parents, my siblings, and my grandparents, there were 7 people and 11 pieces of luggage, and we took trains. And this is the apartment that they lived in Paris after the war. And this is my grandfather, my dad, my brother, my mom, and me. My sister is missing from the picture, as many from our childhood. I guess my grandmother was taking the picture. But anyhow, it was really important for my grandparents to return to Paris as American tourists, and I'm glad they had that opportunity. Thank you for letting me tell my grandmother's story. Does anybody have any questions?
You mentioned the little Hungarian restaurant
Yes.
in Bartlett Street. How did that come about?
I don't know. I mean, they came, well, I'll tell you what I know. And my grandmother had a really strained relationship with this aunt, so we didn't know much about her. They immigrated to the United States before World War II. The family legend is that they might have been coming to escape the police and prosecution in Hungary. So they ended up in the United States, and she opened a restaurant that might have been on the second floor of a building. And there's stories about some mafia connections. I don't know if it's true, but Print newspaper, which is a local newspaper, did a piece about it. And that's where I've learned most of what I know about it. Did you go to that restaurant ever?
Yeah.
Oh.
You gave a very, very vivid and detailed picture of the march. When were you told about it? And were you told those details, or did they come to you through your parents and gradually as you got older? In other words, when did this story unfold for you?
So it came in pieces. I guess the first thing I learned about the Holocaust, I was a very nosy child, and I loved going through my mother's drawers. She had all sorts of jewelry hidden in, her sock drawer, and our baby teeth in a pill bottle somewhere. But I found a piece of paper that had a typed, like single-space typed testimony. And that was the first, I must have been like 9 years old. I was quite young. I don't think I really understood what I read. That sort of was a very loose outline, or not loose, but not very detailed outline of my grandmother's experience. Then when I was about 13, my grandmother had made an audio tape for the Holocaust Center when it was over on McKee Place. And this is the weird part. My dad took my brother and I there. So I was 13, my brother was 10, and we sat in this room with my dad and listened to an audio tape of my grandmother, which just seems a strange thing to take children to. But anyhow, we survived. So I heard that, and it was after, when I was like 12 or 13, that I began to ask her questions, and she began to tell me things. So did my grandfather. But then in the 90s, she made, I think it was the 90s or the early 2000s, she made a video for the Shoah Foundation. Yeah. And I have that on a flash drive. So I've watched that. But actually through Yad Vashem, they have some great stuff online. And there's actually a very detailed webpage you can go to that talks about the march and has different women telling narratives. My grandmother's one of them that talks about what happened on this day and that day. So to prepare for this, I kind of took from the videotape stories I remembered and stuff from the from Yad Vashem.
One little follow-up. Did she ever describe to you what she felt the second time she went through Dresden when it had been destroyed?
I remember her talking about just how horrible it was, and that it had been such a beautiful town. But I don't know that she, but she remarked that they went twice and how different it was. But yeah.
I knew your grandmother. I don't remember how I met her, but I know that I used to visit her sometimes when she lived in the apartment building.
Mm-hmm. The Matson.
And I remember her so fondly. I know your parents too, but I remember her so fondly. And one of the memories that I have with her is that we would have coffee and croissants. But, we lived in Paris, so I knew about croissants, but it was the first time I ever saw anybody slice a croissant this way. That's my memory of her, and I was very fond of her.
Oh,
She was a
Yeah.
lovely woman.
she loved croissants. She also loved pizza, extra crispy. She would send it back if it wasn't. So I remember her toasting croissants
Yeah,
because she
she
liked
did.
them to be really crispy. Thank you for this opportunity.
Does anyone have any questions for Lynn, who did the first presentation? Anything? Come on. Question.
She was there.
She's right here. Yolanda, do you have a question?
No.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming to the Holocaust Center tonight. Please stick around for some cheese and crackers and cookies and good stuff. Oh, yes, Dan.
Yeah, one quick, I noticed that you're having that Holocaust thing in October.
Yes.
This past weekend, I was up in Skokie and saw that hologram thing. It is absolutely worthwhile.
Well,
I
yes.
mean, I'm not gonna tell you about it, just be here and you'll be shocked at how great it is.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, we're going to have great programs coming up. If you signed up, you'll be getting e-news blasts about everything we're doing. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Allison. And I think if you have any more questions, if you want to talk to me, I'll be out front. And I also wanted to thank Christina and the rest of the Holocaust Center staff, Ryan, for being here, and Tim, thank you, and Tim, who worked in the PowerPoint. So thank you and have a great night.